There's a worm in the ground, yes it is. That's right.
I'm gonna do something for you that ain't never been done before. Shoot, 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 shoot. I'm gonna make you free.
When Leroy Sugarfoot Bonner passed away in January 2013, he took with him decades of carefully guarded secrets about one of funk music's most influential bands. The Ohio Players had dominated the charts in the 1970s with hits like Fire and Love Rollercoaster, but behind the gold records and sold-out concerts was a story of internal struggles that would eventually tear the band apart. In his final interviews, Bonner finally opened up about what really happened behind the scenes. Leroy Roosevelt. Bonner never set out to become the face of funk music. Born in Hamilton, Ohio in 1943, he was the oldest of 14 children in a family struggling with poverty. At just 14 years old, life at home became so difficult that running away seemed like his only option for survival. Those early years on the streets were harsh, but they shaped the man who would later become known as Sugarfoot. He played harmonica for spare change and snuck into bars to jam with adult musicians, learning his craft in the roughest venues imaginable. When Bonner joined what remained of the Ohio Untouchables in 1964, he wasn't looking for stardom. The original group had already fallen apart when their leader, Robert Ward, left to pursue a solo career. What was left were talented musicians without direction, scrambling to rebuild their musical identity. In young Leroy Bonner, they found something unexpected, a guitarist and vocalist who could transform their conventional R&B sound into something entirely new. But Bonner brought more than musical talent to the group. Growing up as the oldest child responsible for 13 younger siblings had taught him about leadership and responsibility in ways most musicians never experience. He became the force that held the Ohio Players together through their early struggles, keeping them focused when record deals fell through and pushing them to experiment, yet beyond their comfort zones. The transformation from the Ohio Untouchables to the Ohio Players was more than just a name change. It represented Bonner's vision of what funk music could become. While other bands followed established formulas, Bonner pushed his bandmates to experiment with unconventional rhythms, provocative lyrics, and theatrical stage presentations that would become their trademark. The early years were challenging, with band members working day jobs while playing clubs at night, often performing for audiences who didn't understand their revolutionary sound. What the public never knew was how Bonner's difficult childhood influenced his leadership style. Having experienced abandonment and poverty, he was determined to create a musical family that would never fall apart. He insisted on equal sharing of songwriting credits, made sure every band member had input on major decisions, and created an environment where creativity could flourish without ego conflicts. This collaborative approach was revolutionary in an industry where most bands had clear hierarchies and dominant personalities. Bonner understood that the Ohio Players' strength came from their collective chemistry rather than individual star power. He deliberately positioned himself as the frontman while ensuring every member felt valued and heard. But during these formative years, Bonner carried a secret that even his closest bandmates didn't fully understand. Despite his natural charisma and undeniable talent, he struggled with severe stage fright. He initially performed with his back to the audience, terrified of being judged or rejected. This vulnerability became both his greatest strength and his most carefully guarded secret. It drove him to perfectionism in the studio and made him constantly work to improve his craft. But it also made him hypersensitive to criticism and paranoid about to anyone who might threaten the unity he had worked so hard to create. As the Ohio Players gained recognition in the late 1960s, Bonner realized that success would bring its own challenges. By 1973, the Ohio Players had achieved everything Bonner had dreamed of. Their breakthrough hit, Funky Worm, reached #1 on the R&B charts and cracked the Pop Top 20, establishing them as a major force in funk music. Record labels were suddenly interested, concert promoters were calling, and radio stations couldn't get enough of their infectious grooves. But success brought pressures that Bonner hadn't anticipated. The music industry of the 1970s was cutthroat, where artistic integrity often took a back seat to commercial potential. Record executives who had previously ignored the Ohio Players were now demanding creative control over their music, their image, and even their personal lives. The first major conflict came when their label, Westbound Records, began pressuring the band to replicate the success of Funky Worm by recording similar novelty songs. Bonner watched as other funk acts were pushed into creative dead ends, becoming caricatures of themselves in pursuit of chart success. He was determined not to let that happen to his band, but the pressure was relentless. What the public never saw was how these industry demands affected the band's internal dynamics. For the first time since forming, the Ohio Players found themselves arguing about musical direction. The tension reached a breaking point during the recording sessions for their 1974 album Skin Tight. Label executives were constantly present in the studio, making suggestions that sounded more like demands. They wanted more commercial hooks, cleaner production, and less of the raw edge that had made the Ohio Players unique. Bonner later confessed that he seriously considered breaking up the band rather than compromise their sound. The secret that Bonner carried from this period was how close he came to a complete nervous breakdown. The combination of creative pressure, financial stress, and responsibility for his bandmates' livelihoods pushed him to his psychological limits. He began suffering from panic attacks before performances, and there were nights when he couldn't sleep for fear that everything they had built would collapse. The other band members knew something was wrong, but Bonner was too proud to admit his struggles. He maintained his role as the steady leader while privately falling apart. Only years later would he reveal that he had started drinking heavily during this period, not for pleasure, but as a way to calm his nerves and silence the constant anxiety. The irony was that Skin Tight became one of their biggest successes, proving they could maintain their artistic integrity while achieving commercial success. But the process had nearly destroyed Bonner's mental health. The success of Skin Tight led to even greater pressures. Suddenly, everyone wanted a piece of the Ohio Players. Music publishers offered lucrative deals for songwriting rights. Managers promised bigger tours and better contracts, and other musicians tried to poach band members for their own projects. Bonner found himself protecting his musical family from an industry that saw them only as profit centers. The most painful betrayal came when Walter "Junie" Morrison, the keyboardist whose comic vocals had helped make Funky Worm a hit, announced he was leaving to join George Clinton's Parliament Funkadelic. Morrison's departure wasn't just about musical differences. It was about money, recognition, and the lure of working with an established superstar. Bonner took Morrison's leaving as a personal failure, feeling he had broken his promise that the Ohio Players would stick together through success and failure. The secret he would carry for decades was how deeply Morrison's departure wounded him, and how it changed his approach to leadership within the band. From that point forward, Bonner became more protective and controlling. He insisted on being involved in every business decision, every creative choice, and every personnel matter. What others saw as natural leadership, he knew was actually fear. Fear that another important piece of his musical family would be stolen away. The years 1975 and 1976 should have been the happiest of Bonner's life. The Ohio Players were at the peak of their success with back-to-back #1 hits, Fire and Love Rollercoaster. Their albums were going gold, concerts were selling out arenas, and they had achieved the crossover success that most R&B acts could only dream of. But Bonner later confessed that this period of triumph was also when he began to understand the true cost of fame. The problems began with their controversial album covers featuring nude and nearly nude models. While these images helped sell records and generated massive publicity, they also created perception problems that Bonner hadn't anticipated. Music critics began dismissing their artistic achievements, focusing instead on the sensational artwork. Radio programmers complained about the covers while playing their songs, and retail stores demanded censored versions. What bothered Bonner most was how the covers overshadowed the music itself. The Ohio Players had spent years developing a sophisticated sound that blended funk, jazz, and R&B in innovative ways. But all anyone wanted to talk about were the album sleeves. He felt like the band's artistic identity was being reduced to a marketing gimmick, even though the covers had been intended as artistic statements about sexuality and freedom. The internal pressure was worse than the external criticism. Record label executives began pushing for even more provocative covers, treating the band members like interchangeable parts in a commercial machine. They suggested replacing musicians who weren't photogenic enough, pushed for music that better matched the sexual themes of the artwork, and constantly interfered with creative decisions. Bonner's secret from this period was how desperately he wanted to abandon the controversial covers and return to a focus on pure musicianship. But he was trapped by contractual obligations and the financial needs of his band members. The Ohio Players had become a brand, and changing that brand might have meant commercial suicide. The pressure affected every aspect of their lives, with band members expected to maintain certain public personas and appear at events they didn't want to attend. The breaking point came during a meeting with record executives who wanted to push the band in an even more explicitly sexual direction. They suggested hiring professional dancers for stage shows, creating music videos that emphasized the erotic themes, and even changing the band's name to something more commercially appealing. For Bonner, this meeting represented everything wrong with the music industry. Executives with no understanding of or respect for the Ohio Players' artistic journey. That night, Bonner made a decision that would define the rest of his career. He would no longer allow outside forces to dictate the Ohio Players' artistic direction, even if it meant sacrificing commercial success. The secret he carried from this golden period wasn't about success, but about the courage it took to walk away from a system that was slowly destroying everything he valued about making music. By 1979, the Ohio Players were facing a crisis that threatened to destroy everything Bonner had spent 15 years building. The disco era had fundamentally changed popular music, and funk bands that had dominated the mid-1970s were struggling to maintain their relevance. But the real problems weren't external. They were internal, and they had been building for years. The first crack appeared when tensions over money and creative control began splitting the band into factions. Despite Bonner's efforts to maintain equality among band members, success had created disparities that couldn't be ignored. As the frontman and primary songwriter, he was earning more from publishing royalties than other members, even though the band's sound depended on everyone's contributions. Marshall "Rock" Jones, the bass player who had been with the group since the Ohio Untouchables days, began expressing frustration about his role in the band's business decisions. Clarence "Satch" Satchel, whose saxophone work was crucial to their sound, felt that his contributions weren't being properly credited or compensated. Even longtime members were starting to question whether their loyalty to the Ohio Players was limiting their individual opportunities. Bonner's secret during this period was how much these conflicts devastated him personally. He had built his entire identity around being the leader who kept the band together, ensuring everyone was treated fairly and felt valued. Watching his musical family fracture over money and recognition felt like a betrayal of everything he had tried to create. The situation was made worse by external pressures from the music industry. Record sales were declining, concert attendance was dropping, and radio programmers were shifting their focus to newer artists. The Ohio Players were being labeled as yesterday's news, and the constant struggle to prove their continued relevance took a toll on everyone's morale. In late 1979, these tensions exploded during what would become known among band insiders as the Meeting from Hell. Called to discuss the band's future direction and resolve growing financial disputes, the session instead became a brutal airing of grievances that had been festering for years. Satchel accused Bonner of hoarding songwriting credits and making unilateral decisions. Jones complained that he was being treated like an employee rather than a founding member. But in those final conversations, Bonner also revealed something else. Despite all the pain and regret, he was proud of what the Ohio Players had achieved. They had created music that transcended racial and cultural boundaries, influenced countless other artists, and brought joy to millions of people around the world. That legacy, he said, was worth all the struggles they had endured. When Leroy "Sugarfoot" Bonner died on January 26, 2013, he took with him the complete story of the Ohio Players' rise and fall. But the secrets he had finally shared painted a picture of a man who had sacrificed his own peace of mind to create something beautiful and lasting, and who had learned too late that the greatest tragedy wasn't the band's breakup, but his inability to forgive himself for being human.